You're listening to Audiology. Support this channel by becoming a member and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. Between 1929 and 1933, the manufacturing output in the United States took a steep dive, dropping by a whole third. This period, which economist Milton Friedman would later dub the Great Contraction, saw prices plummet by 20%, leading to a deflation that severely hindered the ability to pay off debts. The unemployment rate soared from 4% to 25%, and a staggering one-third of all workers had to settle for part-time roles, earning much less. In total, about half of the nation's workforce was left idle. Before the measures of the New Deal were introduced, there wasn't a safety net for bank deposits in the U.S. When thousands of banks failed, people temporarily lost access to their savings. Though most of the money was eventually recovered, the initial result was widespread fear and panic. At that time, the U.S. didn't offer any form of national safety net like public unemployment insurance or Social Security. Taking care of the poor fell upon families, private charities, and local governments. However, as the economic crisis deepened each year, their resources became increasingly insufficient to meet the growing needs. The nation was in a psychological rut due to the Depression. When Franklin D. Roosevelt was sworn into office on March 4, 1933, restrictions had been placed on bank withdrawals all across the country, leaving many without access to their bank funds. Farm incomes had halved since 1929. From 1930 to 1933, about 844,000 out of 5 million non-farm mortgages were foreclosed. There was a genuine fear among political and business leaders of revolution and anarchy taking root. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., one of the few to remain wealthy during these hard times, once expressed his deep anxiety over the situation, stating, "In those days I felt and said I would be willing to part with half of what I had if I could be sure of keeping under law and order the other half." The term New Deal was created by Stuart Chase, an advisor to Roosevelt, who first used it in a title for his article in the New Republic magazine, just before a major speech by Roosevelt. The inclusion of the phrase in Roosevelt's speech was a last-minute decision by his speechwriter, Rosenman. When Roosevelt accepted the Democratic nomination for president in 1932, he made a bold promise to deliver a New Deal for the American people. Throughout his campaign, Roosevelt laid out his plans to introduce various programs as part of the New Deal if he won the election. These included initiatives for providing relief to the unemployed and launching public works projects. When Roosevelt took office, he had a game plan ready to tackle the Great Depression, but he was also willing to try out new ideas to see what worked best. He was surrounded by a group of key advisors, often called the Brain Trust, who were big believers in hands-on government action to sort out economic issues. Frances Perkins, his Secretary of Labor, was a major influence on his policies. She had a list of wishes for her role that included things like a 40-hour work week, a minimum wage, and Social Security, among other progressive ideas. Roosevelt's New Deal, which aimed to get the country out of the Depression, didn't just emerge out of nowhere. It drew from a variety of ideas that had been circulating since the early 20th century. Some of these ideas aimed to break up big monopolies, drawing inspiration from historical figures like Andrew Jackson and Thomas Jefferson. Thurman Arnold was a key figure in pushing these anti-monopoly efforts. Meanwhile, others in the New Deal looked back to the government's methods during World War I for ideas on how to boost the economy, like Hugh S. Johnson from the National Recovery Administration. And then there were ideas that seemed new, but were actually revitalized from the 1920s, such as the Tennessee Valley Authority. The early years of the New Deal, from 1933 to 1934, were a mix of conservatism when it came to spending, but open-minded about trying different strategies to fix the economy. However, it's worth noting that the Socialist Party didn't really get a say in these policies, seeing a major decrease in its influence. Roosevelt didn't just come up with policies, he also created a slew of new agencies to carry out these plans. People often remember these agencies by their initials, making them a familiar part of American conversation about this era. People across the United States were deeply unhappy with the state of the economy during the early 1930s, facing issues like high unemployment, falling wages, and lower profits. A lot of the frustration was directed at President Herbert Hoover and some of his policies, including the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act and the Revenue Act of 1932. When Franklin D. Roosevelt took office, he had a huge amount of support and pressure from Americans of different political backgrounds to take swift action. Roosevelt responded by launching an impressive array of new programs during his first 100 days in office. This period was marked by an intense collaboration with Congress, which approved nearly every proposal he made and even passed some measures that he hadn't supported, like the creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which insured bank accounts. The idea that the first 100 days of a presidency are critically important originated with Roosevelt's dynamic start. Walter Lippmann, a notable commentator of the time, captured the transformation by saying, "At the end of February, we were a congeries of disorderly, panic-stricken mobs and factions. In the 100 days from March to June, we became again an organized nation, confident of our power to provide for our own full security and to control our own destiny." As for the economy, it had hit rock bottom in March 1933, but then began to recover swiftly and robustly. According to economic indicators, the economy saw its lowest ebb in early March, but then experienced a sharp uptick. The Federal Reserve Index of Industrial Production, for example, had dropped to a low of 52.8 in July 1932 and was only slightly better by March 1933 at 54.3. However, by July 1933, it had climbed to 85.5, marking a significant recovery of 57% in just 4 months. This upward trend continued strong until 1937, with most aspects of the economy not only recovering, but also surpassing the levels seen in the late 1920s, with the notable exception of employment, which didn't fully rebound until World War II. From 1932 to 1937, as the population grew by nearly 4 million, the economy needed to create around 938,000 new jobs just to keep employment rates stable. In 1933, Lewis Williams Douglas, the budget director, crafted the Economy Act, which was approved on March 15th. The essence of this act was to bring the federal budget under control by reducing the salaries of those working for the government and decreasing veterans' pensions by 15%, aiming to save around $500 million annually. This move was particularly reassuring to those worried about the deficit, showing them that the newly elected president was keeping an eye on the nation's finances. President Roosevelt explained his approach to the budget in 2 components. There was the standard federal budget, which he managed to balance, and then there was the emergency budget meant specifically for tackling the Depression, and it was understood that this wouldn't be balanced, at least not in the short term. Initially, Roosevelt was in favor of keeping the budget balanced, but he quickly began to support spending more than the budget allowed to back his array of programs designed to counter the Depression. However, Douglas didn't agree with distinguishing between a normal budget and an emergency budget. By 1934, he had resigned and began openly voicing his criticisms against the New Deal policies of Roosevelt. One particular point of contention was the bonus bill, which promised a cash bonus to World War I veterans. Roosevelt was against it, but Congress passed it anyway, despite his veto in 1936. Right before the election that year, $1.5 billion was distributed to about 4 million veterans as a kind of bonus welfare benefit. Despite the economic challenges of the time, Roosevelt's team, known as the New Dealers, didn't subscribe to the idea that government spending could be the remedy, a viewpoint championed by economist John Maynard Keynes. Instead, many leading economists and figures like Henry Morgenthau from the Treasury advocated for adhering to balanced budgets as the way forward. When the Great Depression began, the economy was severely impacted by a domino effect, starting with massive losses in investment banking, which led to a wave of bank failures and credit freezes. The trouble started when people, worried their banks might go under, began withdrawing their deposits in large numbers, creating a vicious cycle. The more money people took out, the more likely it was that the bank would actually fail, prompting even more individuals to withdraw their savings. Economists Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz noted that this massive withdrawal of funds effectively reduced the amount of money circulating in the economy, making the economic slump even more severe. The downturn was characterized by falling prices and reduced business activity, which spelled disaster for many banks. By 1933, an astonishing 40% of United States banks had failed. President Herbert Hoover considered the idea of a bank holiday to stop the bank runs, but was concerned it might cause widespread panic. However, Franklin D. Roosevelt, upon taking over the presidency, chose a different approach. He reassured the nation through a radio broadcast, explaining the crisis in simple terms and outlining his plan to address it. He then did what Hoover had hesitated to do. He temporarily closed all the banks. On March 9, 1933, Roosevelt swiftly moved the Emergency Banking Act through Congress with the support of Hoover's former advisors. Signed into law on the same day, it aimed to reopen financially stable banks under the vigilant supervision of the Treasury, with emergency funding if necessary. Within 3 days of its enactment, 3/4 of the federal banks were operational again, drawing back billions in hoarded cash and gold and stabilizing the system. By the year's end, over 4,000 smaller banks had permanently closed, having been merged into larger institutions. The total loss to depositors was significant, but they eventually received about 85 cents for every dollar deposited. The aftermath of this crisis led to the introduction of the Glass-Steagall Act, which separated commercial and investment banking and established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, to insure deposits up to $2,500, greatly diminishing the risk of future bank runs. This legislative change was transformative. Whereas the 1920s saw an average of over 500 bank failures each year, after 1933, failures dropped to less than 10 a year. This regulation brought an unprecedented level of financial stability, marking the end of the era of widespread bank runs. Under the gold standard, the United States made sure the dollar could be exchanged for gold. To battle deflation and keep the banking system from collapsing, the Federal Reserve needed to lower interest rates to add more money into the economy. However, doing this could have caused gold to flow out of the country because under the gold standard, when a country lost gold but still wanted to stick to the standard, it had to reduce its money supply and let prices fall, a process known as deflation. This meant that as long as the Federal Reserve had to maintain the dollar's gold value, it couldn't do much to stop the banking system from falling apart. In March and April, through various laws and executive orders, the government put a halt to the gold standard. President Roosevelt took steps to stop gold from leaving the country by banning gold exports unless approved by the Treasury. Anyone with a lot of gold had to trade it in for United States dollars at a set price. The Treasury would no longer exchange gold for dollars, and gold was no longer accepted as payment for debts, both publicly and privately. This allowed the United States dollar to be traded on international markets without a fixed gold price. The price of gold was then adjusted from $20.67 per ounce to $35 per ounce with the Gold Reserve Act of 1934. These actions gave the Federal Reserve the ability to increase the amount of money in circulation to meet the economy's needs. The market reacted positively to these changes, hopeful that the drop in prices would stop. Christina Romer, in her essay, What Ended the Great Depression, published in 1992, noted that this policy boosted industrial production by 25% by 1937 and 50% by 1942, showing its success in helping end the Great Depression. Before the stock market crash of 1929, there were no federal rules governing the stock market. Companies with publicly traded stocks did not have to share regular reports with their investors, and some even shared reports that were misleading, cherry-picking data that made them look better than they actually were. To make sure a crash like that did not happen again, the government passed the Securities Act of 1933. This law made it a requirement for companies with publicly traded securities to disclose key financial information, including their balance sheets, profit and loss statements, and details about how much their top executives were paid. Plus, these reports had to be checked by independent auditors to ensure they were truthful. Following that, in 1934, the Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC, was created to keep an eye on the stock market and put a stop to any misleading practices by companies regarding their reporting and the sale of their stock. In a move that really boosted the appeal of his New Deal, Roosevelt tackled a major topic that had everyone talking back in the 1920s. He signed a law that made it okay to make and sell alcohol again. This was a significant move because it set the stage for the end of Prohibition, something already being worked on through a new constitutional amendment, the 21st, which would officially end Prohibition later in 1933. This change didn't just bring in more money for states and cities, it also made Roosevelt quite popular, particularly in urban and ethnically diverse areas, because he was the one who made drinking legal again. A major focus was placed on providing immediate assistance to approximately 1/3 of the American population most severely impacted by the Depression. This initiative aimed not only to offer short-term relief to those facing hardships and joblessness, but also to use local and state funds, despite their reduction due to decreased tax revenues, to create jobs for the unemployed. Intriguingly, New Deal relief efforts extended beyond offering employment. They enabled the construction of essential community infrastructure like schools, municipal buildings, water systems, sewers, roads, and parks, all tailored to meet local needs. While funding for the regular military, including the Army and Navy, experienced cuts, President Roosevelt ingeniously managed relief funds to address their reported necessities. Command of all the civilian conservation corps camps, an operation that helped young men find employment, was given to Army officers, with their salaries being covered by the relief budget. On another avenue, the Public Works Administration directed funds into significant defense projects, like the construction of warships, among them 2 aircraft carriers, with these expenses being supported by the Public Works Administration. Additionally, the Public Works Administration was involved in producing warplanes, and the Works Progress Administration undertook the construction of military bases and airfields, showcasing a multifaceted approach to both boosting employment and enhancing the country's infrastructure and defense capabilities during a time of economic uncertainty. To help boost the economy and reduce unemployment, the National Industrial Recovery Act introduced the Public Works Administration. This initiative was all about jump-starting substantial public construction projects. Think massive endeavors such as building government offices, airports, hospitals, schools, roads, bridges, and even dams. Between 1933 and 1935, the Public Works Administration invested a whopping $3.3 billion into the hands of private companies to bring about 34,599 projects to life, including some really significant ones. Additionally, the National Industrial Recovery Act was designed to also support affordable housing and the improvement of neighborhoods through various construction and renovation projects, all under public oversight. During this time under President Roosevelt, a huge number of people found work in these government-funded projects. They were building everything from bridges and airports to dams and post offices, not to mention laying down hundreds of thousands of miles of roads. The efforts also extended to environmental projects. They worked on reforesting and controlling floods to recover millions of hectares of land that had been hit hard by erosion and neglect. It's been noted by experts that Roosevelt's New Deal didn't just make a mark on the economy. It quite literally reshaped the American landscape. Franklin Delano Roosevelt deeply cared about revitalizing the rural United States and saw this as key to the nation's overall economic recovery. Together with his proactive Secretary of Agriculture, Henry Agard Wallace, they focused on reviving agriculture by increasing farm price, even though it meant that city dwellers, especially the poor, would have to pay more for their food. There was significant poverty in rural areas, particularly in the South, which Roosevelt's administration aimed to address with various programs. These included the Resettlement Administration, the Rural Electrification Administration, and other welfare projects across agencies like the Works Progress Administration, National Youth Administration, Forest Service, and Civilian Conservation Corps. These initiatives spanned from introducing school lunches, building new facilities, to conservational efforts like reforestation. In an ambitious move, 1933 saw the launch of the Tennessee Valley Authority, aiming for large-scale dam construction to not only prevent flooding, but also generate electricity and modernize agriculture in the region. The same year, the Farmers Relief Act compensated farmers for reduced production, which effectively doubled their income by 1937. The agriculture sector had previously boomed in the 1920s, but fell into depression due to overproduction, aggravated by the Great Depression. By early 1933, agriculture was on the brink of collapse, highlighted by unsold crops and livestock. The Roosevelt administration responded with several measures aimed at supporting farmers, such as the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which established the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration sought to increase commodity prices by controlling output, although it involved controversial measures like destroying crops and livestock to reduce supply. Despite achieving a measure of recovery in farm incomes and general well-being, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration faced opposition from the public, and in 1936 it was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. It was replaced by a program that subsidized not the reduction, but the adjustment of crops. Roosevelt didn't stop there. Various other measures were enacted to support the rural economy, from credit access, mortgage relief, to research and conservation efforts. These initiatives set the groundwork for modern agricultural policy. The late 1930s saw the introduction of the Farm Security Administration and the Food Stamp Plan, aimed at supporting both rural and urban needy populations. Although the Food Stamp Plan ceased during World War II, it made a comeback in the 60s and evolved into what is known today as the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. surviving despite challenges due to its widespread benefit across different sectors of society. The recovery effort was all about starting the economy back to its previous strength through numerous programs. By the year 1937, these efforts seemed to have paid off according to most economic measurements. However, unemployment was the one area that did not improve until World War II began. These recovery measures were specifically intended to help lift the economy from its downturn. When examining this period, economic historians, including Price Fishback, have taken a thorough look at the contribution of New Deal spending to improved health outcomes in the 114 biggest cities from 1929 to 1937. Their findings were quite revealing. They concluded that for every additional $153,000 spent on relief efforts in 1935, which is roughly equivalent to $1.95 million today, there was a significant health impact. 1 fewer infant died, 1 fewer person committed suicide, and there were 2.4 fewer deaths from infectious diseases. This research underscores the direct link between economic recovery efforts and improvements in public health during that era. Between 1929 and 1933, the industrial economy in the United States was caught in a severe downward spiral known as deflation. To combat this, starting in 1931, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce suggested a plan that would allow trade associations to cooperate to keep prices stable within their industries, creating government-supported cartels despite this going against existing antitrust laws. The Roosevelt administration decided to entertain these ideas. President Roosevelt and his advisors believed that too much competition and rapid technical advances were causing prices and wages to drop due to overproduction, which in turn was reducing demand and employment, a situation known as deflation. They argued that the government needed to step in with a plan to fix this mess. They came up with the National Industrial Recovery Act, ignoring suggestions to limit the work week to 30 hours. Instead, the National Industrial Recovery Act aimed to increase prices, strengthen unions to boost worker purchasing power, and curb damaging competition with the cooperation of major businesses. At the heart of the National Industrial Recovery Act was the National Recovery Administration, led by former General Hugh S. Johnson. Johnson encouraged businesses to adopt a temporary blanket code, which set a minimum wage between 20 and 45 cents an hour, limited work weeks to 35 to 45 hours, and abolished child labor. He believed these measures would boost the economy by increasing employment and consumer spending. Johnson also initiated the NRA Blue Eagle campaign to get public and political support, pushing for industrial self-government. Surprisingly quickly, nearly every major industry in the country agreed to these plans, leading to a significant 45% increase in industrial production by March 1934 compared to March 1933. However, the pressure of managing the National Recovery Administration took a toll on Johnson, and he showed signs of a mental breakdown. By September 1934, he was replaced by a new body, the National Industrial Recovery Board, with Donald Richburg as the executive director. In a significant turn of events, the National Recovery Administration was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in May 1935, effectively dissolving it. Despite its end, the National Recovery Administration had set important labor standards such as minimum wages and an 8-hour workday, and nearly eradicated child labor, standards later reinforced by the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. Historian William E. Leutenberg observed that while the National Recovery Administration had several achievements, like employing 2 million workers and stopping deflation, it wasn't very effective in speeding economic recovery and might have even slowed it by encouraging restrictive practices. The National Recovery Administration's success depended on the country's sense of crisis, which once dissipated, led to a resurgence of businessmen focused on restrictions and price hikes. The first New Deal also introduced other labor reforms, such as the Wagner-Pizer Act for public employment offices, the Anti-Kickback Act against unfair pay practices, and amendments to the Railway Labor Act to protect workers' right to collective bargaining. Secretary of Labor Francis Perkins played a key role in promoting labor standards, holding conferences to standardize state labor laws, and establishing the Division of Labor Standards to help improve work conditions nationwide. Additional measures supporting labor included the Muscle-Shoals Act with provisions for wages and compensation, and several acts to improve vocational education, protect bankruptcy safeguards for labor, adjust pay and compensation for certain workers, and create a federal credit union law to provide credit to those of small means. Furthermore, legislation was passed to ensure safety and support for workers in various sectors, emphasizing the New Deal's commitment to improving the lives and working conditions of American workers. The New Deal played a pivotal role in transforming the housing sector. Inspired by President Hoover's preliminary efforts, the new spurs aimed to boost the private housing market and increase home ownership. Under this initiative, the Public Works Administration, a branch of the Interior Department, set out to build affordable housing across the country. These low-rent units were targeted at families with lower income. Despite facing significant opposition from the private housing industry, with the notable exception of New York City, the plan faced another hurdle. The White House directed much of its funding towards projects that provided immediate relief by creating jobs, believing that investing $1 million federal in these projects would generate employment for many. By 1937, this shift in focus resulted in the completion of only 49 housing projects, comprising around 21,800 apartments. The Federal Housing Administration took control of the program in 1938, marking a new phase in government-backed housing. Additionally, starting in 1933, the New Deal introduced the Homeowners Loan Corporation. This organization played a crucial role in assisting homeowners by refinancing mortgages, making it easier for people to own or keep their homes. This suite of programs under the New Deal represents a significant effort to make housing more accessible and to stabilize the housing market during a period of economic uncertainty. The Homeowners Loan Corporation, also known as HOLC, simplified the mortgage process and made it more uniform across the country. The Federal Housing Administration, abbreviated as FHA, established nationwide guidelines for how homes should be constructed. In 1934, to tackle the issue of inadequate housing in alleyways, Congress established the Alley Dwelling Authority with a specific goal: to provide for the discontinuation of the use as dwellings of the buildings situated in alleys in the District of Columbia. In the same year, lawmakers passed the National Housing Act with two main goals: to increase employment and to facilitate the process for private borrowers to obtain loans for home repairs and construction. By 1938, modifications were made to this act. According to a study, these amendments included the extension of insurance for repair loans, allowing up to 90% of a small owner-occupied home's value to be covered by mortgage insurance, and the provision of insurance for mortgages on rental property. This marks the start of a period where the United States saw discriminatory practices like redlining become commonplace, especially under the guidance of the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC for short. They used maps to decide which housing loans would receive federal support, and one of the main things they looked at was race. If a neighborhood had what they called inharmonious racial groups, it would be marked in red or yellow based on the number of black residents. This racial consideration was explicitly outlined in the Federal Housing Administration Underwriting Manual, which the HOLC followed when making their maps. What this essentially meant was that black Americans were often denied mortgages backed by the federal government. This practice largely excluded them from the housing market and made it almost impossible for anyone to secure loans for homes in predominantly black neighborhoods. Furthermore, other federal policies related to neighborhood development insisted on segregation for any project to receive support. They even went as far as requiring racially restrictive covenants, which stopped white homeowners from selling their homes to black buyers. This set of policies created deep systemic barriers to housing equity. The idea behind the reforms was straightforward: the belief that the turmoil of the Depression resulted from the market's natural fluctuations, and that the government's intervention could help stabilize the situation, ensuring stability for everyone from farmers to workers. The objective was to address the causes of the Depression and prevent such a catastrophe from recurring. Essentially, these measures were intended to rebuild America's economy while avoiding previous errors. When it comes to economic thinkers, most concur that steps toward protectionism, reaching their zenith with the 1930 Smoot-Hawley Act, only exacerbated the Depression. While campaigning for president in 1932, Roosevelt was already critiquing this act. Then in 1934, Cordell Hull introduced the Reciprocal Tariff Act. This legislation endowed the president with the power to establish trade agreements with other countries. This was a pivotal moment for Roosevelt, allowing him to pursue a more open trade policy globally. This strategy is often regarded as the inception of the current era of free trade. In Puerto Rico, the strategy was somewhat distinct. The Puerto Rico Reconstruction Administration oversaw a variety of projects designed to bolster the island, Initiatives included land reform to aid small farmers, the establishment of cooperatives, promoting a diverse range of crops, and nurturing local industries. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.